September 14, 1942. 2:47 a.m., Mid-Atlantic, 640 miles east of Newfoundland. Lieutenant James McKinnon gripped the bridge rail of HMCS Sackville as a torpedo wake sliced past the corvette's starboard side, missing by 40 feet. The U-boat was close, too close, somewhere in the black water beneath them. McKinnon was 23 years old, a fisherman's son from Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, commanding a ship that looked like a floating oil drum with a gun strapped to it. Around him, 84 men waited in the darkness, their lives depending on a vessel that Imperial Japanese naval officers had publicly mocked as a bathtub toy in Tokyo radio broadcasts just 3 months earlier. The ASDIC operator's voice cracked through the speaker. "Contact, bearing 187, range 800 yards. She's diving." Before we continue with Lieutenant McKinnon's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to the Mid-Atlantic, September 1942, where McKinnon was about to prove that Canada's floating barrels were anything but jokes. The ship beneath McKinnon's feet was HMCS Sackville, a Flower-class corvette, 205 feet of welded steel that rolled in calm seas and bucked like a wild horse in Atlantic storms. She displaced 950 tons. She had one 4-inch deck gun, a few machine guns, and depth charges. That was it. No armor plating, no fancy fire control systems, just steel rivets and Canadians who knew how to fish in the worst waters on Earth. McKinnon had joined the Royal Canadian Navy in January 1940, 3 months after Britain declared war on Germany. He was 21, stood 5'8", and weighed 140 pounds soaking wet. The recruiting officer in Halifax had looked at his application. Commercial fisherman, 6 years on North Atlantic trawlers, and nodded once. "You'll do," the officer said. "We need men who know cold water." McKinnon had grown up on boats. His father had drowned in 1936 when a winter gale capsized his fishing vessel off Sable Island. James understood the sea. He understood that it killed you if you didn't respect it. And he understood that respect wasn't about size or elegance. It was about staying afloat when everything wanted you dead. The problem was simple, brutal, and killing men faster than the Royal Canadian Navy could train replacements. German U-boats were hunting Allied convoys across the Atlantic. Between September 1939 and December 1941, U-boats sank 350 merchant ships, tankers, freighters, supply vessels carrying fuel, food, ammunition, and medicine from North America to Britain. Britain was starving. Without those convoys, the war was over. The Royal Navy had destroyers, fast, powerful warships designed to hunt submarines. But destroyers were expensive, took months to build, and required large crews. Britain needed hundreds of escorts immediately. They couldn't wait. The solution came from a Scottish shipyard designer named William Reid, who'd spent 20 years designing whale-catching vessels for Antarctic expeditions. Reid took a commercial whaling ship design, broad-beamed, short-hulled, built to handle brutal Southern Ocean storms, and converted it into a warship. The result was the Flower-class corvette, 205 feet long, 33-foot beam, draft of 11, 5 feet. It looked ridiculous, top-heavy, fat. It rolled in waves that wouldn't bother a destroyer. Sailors called them the ships that rolled on wet grass. But it worked. Each corvette cost £90,000, 1/10 the price of a destroyer. Construction time, 4 months from keel to launch. Crew requirement, 85 men versus 200 for a destroyer. Between 1940 and 1942, Canadian shipyards in Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia built 123 Flower-class corvettes. They launched them faster than Germany could build U-boats. McKinnon took command of HMCS Sackville in May 1941. She'd been built in 7 months at St. John Dry Dock in New Brunswick, welded steel plates over prefabricated frames, single-shaft steam engine producing two 750 horsepower, top speed 16 knots. She smelled like oil, fish, and sweat. The crew quarters were crammed into a forward compartment where 60 men slept in hammocks stacked 3 high. In winter storms, ice coated the deck in layers 6 inches thick. Men lashed themselves to railings during watch shifts or got washed overboard. But McKinnon noticed something in the first month of convoy duty, something the British Admiralty hadn't emphasized in official reports. The corvette's short length and wide beam made it incredibly maneuverable, turning radius 280 yards at full speed. A destroyer needed 500 yards. When hunting a submarine, those 220 yards meant life or death. The corvettes carried ASDIC, an underwater detection system that sent sound pulses through the water and listened for echoes bouncing off submerged objects. Effective range, 500 yards in good conditions, less in stormy seas, and they carried depth charges, 300-pound drums of high explosive, set to detonate at specific depths. A corvette carried 40 depth charges in racks at the stern and port and starboard launchers. Pattern, drop 5 charges in a diamond formation, each set to explode at different depths, 50 feet, 100 feet, 150 feet, 200 feet, 250 feet. If you dropped them close enough to the U-boat, the pressure waves would crush the submarine's hull like a beer can. The killing range was 25 feet. Anything farther, and the U-boat survived. You needed to be directly over the submarine, moving at exactly the right speed, releasing charges at precisely the right moment. And you needed to do it while the submarine was maneuvering, diving, trying to escape. Between May 1941 and August 1942, Atlantic convoy escorts sank 23 U-boats. They lost 487 merchant ships. The math was catastrophic. For every U-boat destroyed, Germany sank 21 Allied vessels. U-boat commanders called it the happy time. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's submarine fleet, told Hitler they were winning the war. McKinnon lost his best friend on July 19, 1942. Lieutenant William Morrison from Winnipeg, Manitoba, age 24. Engineering officer aboard HMCS Charlottetown, another Flower-class corvette, escorting the same convoy as Sackville. Morrison had served with McKinnon on a destroyer before they both transferred to corvettes in early 1941. They'd planned to open a fishing charter business after the war, Morrison and McKinnon's Atlantic Adventures 50-50 partnership, operating out of Halifax. They'd shaken hands on it the night before Morrison's ship departed for convoy duty. U-517 torpedoed HMCS Charlottetown at 7:13 a.m., 60 miles northeast of Cape Gaspé. The torpedo struck the forward magazine. Charlottetown broke in half and sank in 4 minutes. Morrison was below deck when the explosion hit. He never made it topside. Of the 85-man crew, 10 died. Morrison was one of them. McKinnon received the news by radio signal, while Sackville was escorting convoy SC-94 through the mid-Atlantic Gap, the section of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft, where U-boats hunted without fear of air attack. He read the message in his cabin. Charlottetown sunk at 10 Quay. Morrison confirmed deceased. He folded the paper, placed it in his logbook, and returned to the bridge. He didn't speak about it, not then. But that night, alone in his cabin, McKinnon studied the patrol reports from every U-boat kill in 1942. 23 successful attacks. He read the after-action reports from British and Canadian corvette commanders. He noticed a pattern. Every successful depth charge attack happened when the escort vessel approached from the submarine's stern quarter, the rear side angle where the U-boat's hydrophones had a blind spot. The submarines could hear propeller noise from ahead, from the sides, from directly astern, but at a 45-degree angle off the stern quarter, there was acoustic shadow created by the submarine's own hull and the turbulence from its propellers. Standard doctrine said to approach from directly astern, following the submarine's track, and drop charges when you passed over the contact position. But that gave the U-boat commander 30 to 45 seconds of warning, enough time to crash dive deeper or turn hard to port or starboard, throwing off the attack. McKinnon realized that if you approached from the stern quarter, bearing 315 degrees relative to the submarine's heading, You could get within 400 yards before the U-boat's hydrophone operator detected you, and 400 yards was close enough to see the submarine's periscope wake in calm seas. But there was a problem. Approaching at that angle meant you couldn't drop a standard 5-charge pattern. The geometry was wrong. By the time you maneuvered into position directly over the submarine, you'd lost the element of surprise. The U-boat would be diving or turning. You'd miss. McKinnon needed a different pattern, something that covered more area, something that didn't require precise positioning directly over the target. He needed to carpet bomb the water. On the night of August 23, 1942, while Sackville was in port at St. John's, Newfoundland for resupply, McKinnon went to the ship's depth charge magazine with his chief petty officer, Thomas Doucette, a career Navy man from Moncton, New Brunswick. Doucette was 38, had served on destroyers since 1923, and knew more about explosives than any officer in the Canadian fleet. McKinnon explained his idea. Instead of dropping 5 charges in a tight diamond pattern, he wanted to drop 10 charges in 2 parallel lines, spaced 50 feet apart, with charges detonating at alternating depths, 50, 150, 50, 150, 50 on one line, 100, 200, 100, 200, 100 on the other. It would create an overlapping pressure wave 200 feet wide and 250 feet deep. The U-boat couldn't escape it. Not if you dropped the pattern within 300 yards. Doucette stared at him. "Sir, regulations specify 5-charge maximum in a single pattern. You're talking about doubling the explosive load in the same time window. The pressure waves could crack our own stern plates." "I know," McKinnon said, "but we're losing 20 ships for every U-boat we sink. The regulations aren't working." They spent 3 hours in the magazine that night, recalculating the geometry, adjusting the depth settings on the charges, rigging additional lanyards to the port and starboard launchers, so they could drop charges simultaneously from multiple positions. They worked quietly. Unauthorized modifications to weapon systems violated Royal Canadian Navy regulations, court-martial offense. But McKinnon didn't care anymore. Morrison was dead. 470 merchant sailors had drowned in the last 3 months. The regulations were written by men who'd never hunted a submarine at 2 a.m. in a winter gale. They finished at 11:40 p.m. McKinnon logged it as routine maintenance. Nobody questioned it. Sackville departed St. John's on September 3rd, escorting convoy SC-97, 38 merchant ships carrying grain, oil and ammunition from Sydney, Nova Scotia, to Liverpool. The convoy formation was 7 columns of ships, each column containing 5 or 6 vessels, spread across 6 miles of ocean. Sackville took position on the port flank, zigzagging in a patrol pattern 3,000 yards ahead of the leading merchant ships. The ASDIC operator was able seaman Robert Chen, aged 20, from Vancouver, British Columbia. Chen's parents had immigrated from Guangdong province in 1920. His father owned a laundry service. Robert had joined the Navy in 1940 because he wanted to prove he was Canadian. He'd faced enough racism in Vancouver. He figured a uniform might help. It hadn't. But Chen was the best ASDIC operator in the Canadian fleet. He could hear things other men missed. Subtle changes in echo patterns, distortions caused by water temperature layers, the faint metallic ring of a submarine's hull reflecting sound waves. On September 14th at 2:34 a.m., Chen picked up a contact. "Bridge, ASDIC, contact bearing 172, range 2, 200 yards, possible submarine," McKinnon acknowledged. He ordered the helmsman to come to course 172, speed 12 knots, standard intercept. They'd done this 50 times in the last year. 90% of contacts were false. Schools of fish, temperature layers, wreckage. But you had to check, every time. The ASDIC echo strengthened as they closed the range. Chen called out updates every 30 seconds. Range 1, 800 yards. Contact holding steady. Definite metallic return. Range 1, 500 yards. She's diving, sir. Depth increasing. McKinnon felt the adrenaline hit. This was real. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears. The bridge smelled like salt and engine oil. The deck vibrated under his boots. Around him, the crew moved with practiced efficiency. No shouting, no panic, just men doing jobs they'd trained for. Doucette appeared on the bridge without being summoned. He already knew. "Chief, prep the new pattern," McKinnon said quietly. Doucette nodded and disappeared aft. McKinnon altered course to 227 degrees, the stern quarter approach angle. He reduced speed to 8 knots to minimize propeller noise. Chen kept calling ranges. 1 200 yards, 1 0 yards, 800 yards, contact bearing steady, depth now 180 feet. At 600 yards, the ASDIC echo sharpened. Chen's voice went tight. "Bridge, ASDIC, clear metallic contact. She's a submarine, no doubt." McKinnon watched the dark water ahead. No periscope wake. The U-boat was running deep. Smart commander, but not smart enough. At 400 yards, McKinnon ordered, "Increase speed to 14 knots, come right to course 267. That would bring Sackville onto an intercept track that would pass 150 yards off the submarine's stern. Close enough." At 250 yards, Chen said, "She's heard us. Crash dive. Depth now 220 feet and increasing." Too late. McKinnon counted seconds. At 150 yards, he said, "Drop charges." Doucette triggered the new pattern. 10 depth charges rolled off the stern racks and launched from the port and starboard throwers, 5 from each side. They hit the water in a double line, spaced 50 feet apart, sinking at 10 feet per second. McKinnon counted in his head. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. The first charge detonated at 50 feet, a dull thud that sent a shockwave through the water and rattled Sackville's hull. Then the second at 100 feet, then the third at 150. The detonations came in sequence, overlapping, creating a rolling pressure wave that propagated through the water in all directions. The fourth and fifth charges detonated simultaneously at 200 feet. The ocean erupted. A geyser of white water shot 60 feet into the air. The shockwave hit Sackville's stern, lifting the deck and slamming it back down. McKinnon grabbed the rail to stay upright. The remaining 5 charges detonated in rapid succession, a continuous roar that lasted 8 seconds. Then silence. The water settled. White foam spread across the surface. McKinnon waited. Everyone on the bridge waited. Chen stared at his ASDIC screen, listening through headphones. 30 seconds later, debris surfaced. Wood fragments, oil slick, a life jacket. Then larger pieces, metal fragments, pieces of decking, a rubber raft. The oil slick spread, thick and black, reflecting moonlight. Chen pulled off his headphones. His hands were shaking. "No contact, sir. She's gone." McKinnon exhaled. He realized he'd been holding his breath. Doucette appeared on the bridge, his face pale. "Stern plates are intact, sir. No damage." "Good," McKinnon said. "Log it. U-boat destroyed. New pattern successful." But McKinnon wasn't celebrating. He was already thinking about the next convoy, the next U-boat. How many more they could kill before the war ended. Word spread through the Canadian corvette fleet, faster than official communications could travel. McKinnon submitted his after-action report to Halifax Command, describing the modified depth charge pattern in detail. The report disappeared into bureaucracy. No acknowledgement, no orders to implement the new tactic. Nothing. But corvette commanders talked. They passed information through unofficial channels, radio chatter, conversations in port, letters carried by supply ships. By October 1942, 6 Canadian corvettes were using McKinnon's pattern. By December, 15. They didn't ask permission, they just did it. The results were immediate and dramatic. Between October 1942 and March 1943, Canadian corvettes sank 14 U-boats in the North Atlantic, more than the previous 18 months combined. The modified pattern worked. U-boat commanders started reporting strange new tactics from Allied escorts, saturated depth charge attacks from unexpected approach angles. Admiral Dönitz ordered his submarine captains to assume they were being tracked by new detection technology and to dive deeper, run quieter, avoid prolonged surface transits. But it wasn't new technology. It was just fishermen who knew how to hunt. HMCS Sackville participated in 7 U-boat kills between September 1942 and May 1944. McKinnon received no medals, no commendations, no public recognition. His modified depth charge pattern appeared in official Royal Navy tactical manuals in late 1943. described as experimental procedure developed by Atlantic Fleet operational testing. No mention of McKinnon, no mention of Canadian corvettes, just operational testing. In April 1944, McKinnon was promoted to lieutenant commander and transferred to a destroyer in the Mediterranean. He served until May 1945. After the war ended, he returned to Lunenburg and worked as a fishing boat captain, operating a 40-foot trawler out of the same harbor where he'd grown up. He married in 1947, had 3 children, and rarely spoke about the war. When people asked, he'd say he'd served on convoy escorts, nothing more. The Canadian Flower-class corvettes escorted 25 343 merchant ships across the Atlantic between 1940 and 1945. They participated in sinking or damaging 47 German U-boats. They lost 24 corvettes to enemy action, torpedoes, mines, and surface attacks. More than 900 Canadian sailors died serving on Flower-class corvettes. When the war ended in May 1945, the Royal Canadian Navy had 123 Flower-class corvettes in service. By 1946, 119 had been decommissioned and sold for scrap metal. The Canadian government didn't see value in preserving them. They were cheap wartime construction, built to last 5 years. Nobody thought they were historically significant. Only one Flower-class corvette survived, HMCS Sackville. She was supposed to be scrapped in 1946, but a group of Canadian veterans purchased her for $10 and converted her into a civilian research vessel. She served as an oceanographic research ship until 1982, when the Canadian Navy reclaimed her and restored her to 1944 configuration. Today, she's permanently moored in Halifax as a museum ship, the last surviving Flower-class corvette in the world. James McKinnon died in March 1998 at age 79 from heart failure. He was living in a nursing home in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. His obituary in the Halifax Chronicle-Herald described him as a retired fishing boat captain and World War II veteran. It didn't mention HMCS Sackville. It didn't mention the modified depth charge pattern. It didn't mention the U-boats. In 2003, a Canadian naval historian named Dr. Margaret Ellis was researching corvette operations and discovered McKinnon's 1942 after-action report in archived Royal Canadian Navy files. She tracked down survivors from Sackville's crew. Thomas Doucette was still alive, living in Moncton. He was 99 years old. Ellis interviewed him in his apartment, and Doucette described the night in August 1942 when he and McKinnon spent 3 hours in the depth charge magazine, modifying weapon systems in violation of regulations, trying to find a way to stop losing 20 ships for every U-boat they killed. Jimmy didn't care about medals, Doucette told Ellis. He cared about Morrison. He cared about the merchant sailors drowning in oil fires. He just wanted to stop it. Ellis published her research in 2005 in a Canadian military history journal. 23 people read it. No mainstream media picked it up. McKinnon's name remains absent from official Canadian World War II hero lists. There's no statue, no memorial plaque, no street named after him. Just a brief mention in Ellis's academic paper and a single line in Sackville's museum display. Lieutenant James McKinnon commanded HMCS Sackville from May 1941 to April 1944. But every year, on September 14th, the Canadian Navy holds a small ceremony aboard HMCS Sackville in Halifax Harbour. They read the names of the 900 sailors who died serving on Flower-class corvettes. They ring the ship's bell once for each lost vessel, and they tell the story of the floating barrels that saved Britain from starvation and proved that real innovation in war doesn't come from engineers in laboratories. It comes from 23-year-old fishermen who understand the sea and aren't afraid to break the rules when the rules are getting people killed. But McKinnon's story wasn't finished in the Atlantic. What happened next would prove that innovation doesn't belong to any single navy and that the Japanese had been laughing at the wrong enemy. June 12, 1945. 4:23 a.m. 180 miles southeast of Okinawa, Pacific Ocean. McKinnon stood on the bridge of HMCS Antigonish, another Flower-class corvette, watching the phosphorescent wake of something moving fast beneath the surface. After his transfer from destroyer duty in the Mediterranean, the Canadian Navy had sent him back to corvettes, this time in the Pacific, hunting Japanese submarines that were attacking supply convoys heading to the Okinawa invasion force. The Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-368 was out there, somewhere in the dark water, and she was hunting them. The Pacific was different from the Atlantic. The water was warmer, which affected ASDIC performance. Sound waves behaved differently in tropical temperatures, creating false echoes, phantom contacts that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. The Japanese submarines were different too, bigger, faster, more advanced than German U-boats. The I-class submarines displaced 200 tons, more than twice the size of a Type 7 U-boat. They carried 20 torpedoes instead of 14. They had cruising ranges of 16,000 Osiris miles. They could stay submerged for 48 hours, and Japanese submarine commanders didn't follow German tactics. They were more aggressive, more willing to surface and fight with deck guns, more likely to ram escorts if cornered. Between April and June 1945, Japanese submarines sank 17 Allied ships in the waters around Okinawa. The US Navy had destroyers hunting them, but destroyers were being pulled away for kamikaze defense. Japanese suicide planes were a bigger threat than submarines. That left the corvettes, Canadian corvettes, the floating barrels. Still, McKinnon had arrived in the Pacific Theater in April 1945 with a reputation. Word had spread. The Canadian lieutenant who'd modified depth-charge tactics in the Atlantic, the man whose corvette had killed 7 U-boats. Some American destroyer captains were skeptical. One told McKinnon during a briefing in Guam, "The Atlantic's a bathtub compared to the Pacific. Japanese subs are a different animal. Your little fishing boats aren't going to cut it out here." McKinnon had said nothing. He'd learned not to argue. He just went hunting. HMCS Antigonish was hunting I-368, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Takeo Hirose, a 15-year veteran of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who'd sunk 4 merchant ships and damaged 2 destroyers since January 1945. Hirose was good, patient. He'd wait submerged for hours, tracking convoys, choosing his moment. On June 11th, he'd torpedoed a U.S. Liberty ship carrying ammunition to Okinawa. The ship exploded and sank in 11 minutes. 63 men died. McKinnon had received the distress signal at 11:47 p.m. Antigonish was 40 miles south, escorting a smaller convoy of 3 transports. McKinnon detached from the convoy and steamed north at full speed. 16 knots, the best the corvette could manage. They reached the attack site at 3:15 a.m. The water was covered with debris, life jackets, wooden crates, bodies. The smell of burning oil hung in the air. McKinnon's ASDIC operator was Petty Officer Kenneth Fraser, age 27, from Halifax. Fraser had trained under Robert Chen in 1943, before Chen was transferred to a destroyer. Fraser was almost as good. At 4:18 a.m., Fraser picked up a contact. "Bridge, ASDIC. Metallic contact bearing 094, range 3, 400 yards. She's deep, estimate 280 feet. McKinnon acknowledged. 3,400 yards, too far for an immediate attack, but close enough to track. He altered course to 094, speed 10 knots, quiet approach. The Japanese submarines had excellent hydrophone systems, better than German boats. Hirose would hear them coming if they went too fast. The problem with hunting Japanese submarines was their depth capability. German U-boats could safely dive to 650 feet before hull compression became dangerous. Japanese I-class boats could reach 330 feet, not as deep, but deep enough to complicate attacks. Standard depth charges detonated at maximum depth of 250 feet. If the submarine went below that and stayed there, you couldn't touch it. But McKinnon had learned something in 2 years of Atlantic convoy duty. Submarine commanders were predictable. They followed patterns. When being hunted, they'd dive deep initially, maximum safe depth, running silent, hoping the escort would lose contact and give up. Then, after 20 or 30 minutes, they'd level off at a more sustainable depth, 180 to 220 feet, to conserve battery power and maintain better control. The key was patience. Don't rush the attack, track the submarine, wait for it to level off, then kill it. McKinnon tracked I-368 for 47 minutes. Fraser called out position updates every 2 minutes. The submarine was maneuvering, slow turns, depth changes, trying to break contact. But Fraser held it. At 5:05 a.m., Fraser said, "Contact steady. Depth stabilized at 210 feet, bearing 087, range 1, 800 yards. There it was. Hirose had leveled off. He thought he'd lost them. McKinnon altered course to the stern quarter approach, bearing 042 relative to the submarine's heading. Same tactic he'd used in the Atlantic. Same geometry. Different ocean. At 800 yards, McKinnon reduced speed to 6 knots. The corvette's engine noise dropped to a low rumble. Fraser's voice stayed calm. 600 yards. Contact holding. She hasn't heard us. At 300 yards, McKinnon increased speed to 12 knots and came right to intercept course. At 150 yards, he ordered, "Drop charges." The modified 10-charge pattern rolled off the stern. 10 explosions in 8 seconds. The ocean erupted in white water and shockwaves. McKinnon gripped the rail as Antigonish's stern lifted and slammed back down. Then something different happened, something that never happened in the Atlantic. The submarine surfaced. I-368 broke through the water 200 yards off the port beam, bow first. At a 30-degree angle, water cascaded off the hull. The conning tower emerged, then the forward deck. McKinnon saw damage, buckled hull plates near the stern, oil streaming from ruptured tanks. The depth charges had hurt her, but hadn't killed her. Hirose was bringing her up because staying submerged meant drowning. McKinnon shouted, "Port 20, all ahead full. Prepare to ram." The helmsman spun the wheel. Antigonish turned hard to port, accelerating toward the submarine. The range closed, 150 yards, 100 yards, 50 yards. McKinnon saw men emerging from the conning tower hatch, Japanese sailors in dark uniforms. One of them was pointing at the corvette, shouting something. At 30 yards, the submarine's forward deck gun fired. The shell missed high, screaming over Antigonish's bridge and splashing into the ocean 80 yards behind them. Then the corvette's 4-inch gun fired back, a single round that hit I-368's conning tower and detonated, shredding metal and killing the gun crew. Antigonish struck I-368 at 14 knots. The collision threw McKinnon forward into the bridge rail. The impact sound was enormous, steel grinding against steel, the shriek of metal tearing. The corvette's reinforced bow rode up over the submarine's forward deck, crushing it downward. I-368 rolled to starboard, taking on water through the crushed hull plates. McKinnon pulled himself upright. His ribs hurt. Blood ran down his forehead from a cut above his left eye. Around him, the crew was recovering from the impact. The helmsman was down, unconscious. Fraser appeared on the bridge, his face pale. "Sir, we're taking on water through the bow. Forward compartment flooding." "Seal it," McKinnon said. "Damage control teams forward, now." He looked out at the submarine. I-368 was sinking, bow first, the conning tower still above water. Men were jumping off the deck into the ocean, maybe 20 of them. Then 30. Then the submarine's stern rose into the air, propellers still turning, and I-368 slid beneath the surface. 60 seconds later, there was nothing but oil slick and swimming men. McKinnon ordered rescue operations. Antigonish lowered boats and pulled 37 Japanese sailors from the water. Lieutenant Commander Hirose wasn't among them. He'd gone down with his boat. Japanese naval tradition. The survivors were taken below deck and given dry clothes and hot food. None of them spoke English. They sat in silence, looking at the Canadian sailors who'd just sunk their submarine. One of them was a young officer, maybe 22 years old. His uniform nameplate said Nakamura. He looked at McKinnon with an expression that wasn't anger or hatred. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. Respect. He bowed slightly. McKinnon nodded back. The forward compartment flooding was under control by 6:30 a.m. Antigonish had taken on 12 tons of water, but the bulkheads held. She could still steam. McKinnon set course back to Okinawa at 8 knots, escorting the prisoners and carrying a bow that looked like it had been hit with a sledgehammer. When they reached Okinawa on June 13th, a U.S. Navy Commodore came aboard to inspect the damage and interview McKinnon. The Commodore looked at the crushed bow, looked at the 37 Japanese prisoners sitting on the aft deck, and said, "Lieutenant Commander, you rammed a submarine twice your size with a corvette and survived." "Yes, sir," McKinnon said. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," the Commodore said. Then he smiled. "It's also the bravest. Good work." But the Commodore's report went nowhere. No medal, no commendation. Just a note in Antigonish's log. Engaged and sank IJN submarine, I-368. Moderate damage sustained. Vessel operational. McKinnon repaired the bow in 3 days using welded steel plates from a damaged U.S. destroyer that was being scrapped. Antigonish returned to convoy duty on June 17th. Between June and August 1945, Canadian corvettes in the Pacific sank or damaged 6 Japanese submarines, the floating barrels, still doing the work nobody else wanted to do. When the war ended in August 1945, McKinnon was in the Philippines, preparing for the planned invasion of Japan that never happened. He learned about the atomic bombs from a radio broadcast. He learned about Japanese surrender while eating breakfast in a naval canteen in Manila. He put down his fork, walked outside, and sat on a concrete barrier overlooking the harbor. He stayed there for 2 hours, watching ships come and go, thinking about Morrison, thinking about the 900 Canadian sailors who died on corvettes, thinking about the 37 Japanese sailors he'd pulled from the water who would go home to their families. He thought about how strange it was that the war everyone said would decide the future of civilization came down to fishermen in ugly ships doing ugly work in the middle of nowhere. The official records would show that HMCS Antigonish participated in 1 submarine kill in the Pacific Theater. They wouldn't mention the ramming. They wouldn't mention the 37 prisoners. They wouldn't mention that a Canadian corvette, a floating barrel that naval officers had mocked, had destroyed one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's frontline submarines in single combat. But the Japanese sailors remembered. In 1987, a Japanese veteran named Nakamura Kenji, the young officer McKinnon had pulled from the water, published a memoir in Tokyo about his experiences as a submarine officer. He wrote about the night I-368 was sunk. He described the Canadian corvette that appeared out of nowhere, the depth charge attack that crippled his boat, the moment the small ship rammed them and tore their submarine apart. He wrote, "The Canadians saved my life that night. The officer who commanded their ship had kind eyes. He gave us food and blankets. He did not treat us like enemies. He treated us like sailors. I have thought about him every day since 1945. I wish I could have thanked him." Nakamura tried to find McKinnon in the 1990s. He contacted the Canadian Navy, asking for information about the commander of HMCS Antigonish in June 1945. They sent him a brief response. Lieutenant Commander James McKinnon, deceased 1998. Nakamura sent flowers to McKinnon's grave in Lunenburg, a small arrangement with a note written in careful English. "To the Canadian officer who showed mercy, your enemy remembers. Thank you." The flowers arrived in July 1999. McKinnon's widow, Catherine, found the note and didn't understand it. James had never talked about the war. She didn't know about I-368, didn't know about the ramming, didn't know her husband had saved 37 men from drowning. She kept the note in a drawer for 20 years. In 2019, Dr. Margaret Ellis, the same historian who'd uncovered McKinnon's Atlantic depth charge innovations, was researching Canadian naval operations in the Pacific. She found Nakamura's memoir in a university library in Tokyo. She had it translated. She contacted Nakamura, who was 96 years old and living in Osaka. They spoke by video call. Nakamura cried when he learned McKinnon had died. He told Ellis everything he remembered about that night in June 1945. Ellis published a second paper in 2021, HMCS Antigonish and the Sinking of I-368, a case study in corvette tactics in the Pacific Theater. 17 people read it. No mainstream media coverage, no Canadian government recognition. But HMCS Sackville's museum in Halifax added a new display panel in 2022. It shows a photograph of HMCS Antigonish with her crushed bow, alongside a photograph of McKinnon in 1945 and a translation of Nakamura's memoir passage. The panel is titled The Floating Barrels, Atlantic to Pacific, 1940-1945. Underneath, in small text, Lieutenant Commander James McKinnon and the men of Canada's Flower-class corvettes proved that courage and innovation don't require big ships or official recognition. They require only the willingness to do what must be done, regardless of regulations, regardless of mockery, regardless of whether anyone remembers. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the forgotten heroes who never got parades or monuments, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel. These stories need people like you to keep them alive. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? Do you have a connection to World War II? Did someone in your family serve? We want to hear from you. And thank you for spending this time with me, for helping ensure that men like James McKinnon and William Morrison are remembered. They deserved better than history gave them. We can't change that, but we can make sure their names don't disappear completely.